Hello, beautiful community. We're going to steal probably about a quarter of an hour of your time to talk about that bit to the left, to the west of Moscow, Rublevka, where a lot of the recent drones that Ukraine really orchestrated, and why some people on Russian social media celebrated that even though they support the regime. So even in Z radicals, that kind of celebration happened. What's that about? How does that work? And then we'll say a little bit about the Russian propaganda reaction in a couple of days following the drone overflow. And we'll give us a very, very quick, just 2 or 3 minute update about where Russian propaganda is up to today relative to where it was at the beginning of the war. Now, Rublevka is a bit to the west of Moscow, and within that bit there are smaller bits, and these smaller bits are broken down into little villages. Now, as you look at that bit to the west of Moscow and think about entering the smaller bits, what it would look like is something like this. I haven't lived in Moscow since the Soviet period, but I have visited up until the late 2010s. So at first there may be a checkpoint to enter one of the bits within this little bit, within this little region. That would feel very weird to us Westerners, because what are you trying to say? You've made a bit of the outskirts of the city semi-private? What are you talking about? But some of these bits within bits will require a permit, or at least saying the right thing. And so once we're in, there would then be a bunch of little villages within that bit, and each village may have a little cabin and an armed person there, maybe with a German shepherd. And then you get through that, and then you're through to where the residences are, and probably each residence then will have a further little checkpoint with its own guard and maybe somebody who's armed or some German shepherds. So if you wanted to storm that, you may need military backup. And of course, there's the perception that a lot of the people who have been, inappropriately elevated by this regime are beneficiaries of corruption, or at least deeply suspicious advantage, are there. And it's very important at this point to recognize that with Russian opposition politicians, in particular with Mr. Navalny, his domestic message has always been much more popular than his foreign policy message. Right? His anti-Putin foreign policy message has not done as well as his anti-corruption domestic message. There's plenty of resentment there. But it's worth saying something about the type of resentment that it is. Let's do a little detour here. I hope not to lose you, or I might lose you. A very beautiful man called John Rawls died just over 20 years ago, and he worked for a couple of decades on a book that came out in the early 70s called A Theory of Justice. And what that book actually is as a cultural object in sort of US political history, it's a kind of intensification and distillation of what America thinks about how it might organize its economics and politics in terms of the values of justice and fairness. And Rawls was often criticized wrongly by people who said, well, even if your theory is sort of constructive and applies to the United States, and I don't want to say that it does. In fact, John Rawls comes from a radically different philosophical background to myself, and I find his work very alien but admirable. But Rawls would often be told, well, hang on, what would happen if we took your stuff and tried to apply it to Syria or Iraq? It would look embarrassing. And that was often always a misunderstanding of Rawls, because he said, look, the kind of story I've written only applies to societies that already have a shared sense of fairness. And that capacity for cooperation that comes from that. That's a social fact. It's not a philosophical problem. If you don't have it, the kind of conversation I'm trying to have doesn't apply. And in his language, that would be, you've presented me with a society that is outside the range of application of my theory. And what I want to say is that Russia radically lacks a shared sense of fairness. I want to explain what that means, because I believe that the United States, which is bitterly divided, toxically divided, in a way that is existential to US democracy, and in fact, US democracy is both enormously robust and very sick at the same time. And it's only able to be as sick as it is while remaining a democracy because it is so robust. But even Americans who feel themselves to be not political opponents but enemies are still talking to each other in terms of a shared sense of fairness. They're just saying, your conception of fairness, for us both to supposedly share in, is so dangerous that it will destroy our country. And the response back comes, your conception is so dangerous that it will destroy our country. And if I were to share in yours, and I know you've just said the same back to me, but if I were to share in yours, that would end our country. That toxic disagreement, in which indeed my relationship with my opponent and my enemy has lapsed, right, beyond what is democratically healthy. We're not feeling we are on the same side, even in a procedural way. There is still some sense of a shared sense of fairness there, nevertheless, because we're debating about what that thing should be. In Russia, the population, right, is at a stage prior to that. There is just no shared sense of fairness. So the reaction to these folks on Rublevka is resentment that is prior to considerations of fairness and justice. So it's not the feeling, oh my God, this is so unjust. It's just, I resent these buggers and that's it. And that's an important distinction. I hope it comes through a bit, because it really helps us grasp this scale of depoliticization that we often engage with. Now, another broad remark about how Moscow is seen. This is not just Rublevka, this is all of Moscow. And of course, Moscow contains so many bits that are very poor and disadvantaged still. But Moscow is still a country within a country compared to the rest of Russia. And there's generally a hatred toward all of Moscow, not just the privileged bits or the privileged bits out of town. And so before the war, when you saw the National Guard, which would often be taken from little sort of different townships, went to Moscow, would come to Moscow to suppress anti-regime protests, there'd be a kind of glee in their batoning of people on the heads, because they'd think, oh, these Muscovites are getting it. And even I'd go as far as saying that some of the Russian soldiers who come from these extraordinarily depleted, desolate townships all over the country, that they would have had a kind of glee in committing some of the war crimes they committed in Ukraine, in Moscow. So that there would have been some motivation to do a Bucha in Moscow. Now, a quick remark about Prigozhin stoking this sort of resentment toward these privileged Russians. Prigozhin is trying to steal not just the devices for political mobilization that typically Z radicals use. He's also trying to steal a little bit from Navalny, and this is a point that the Russian commentator Vladimir Pastukhov has made. It sounds controversial, but it isn't. But Navalny's sort of anti-corruption message is something that Prigozhin is trying to incorporate. Obviously, he can't incorporate any of Navalny's liberal and democratic stories, but he's trying to steal this. So that's interesting, and that was part of his diatribe after the drones hit. Now, let me say a little bit about where Russian propaganda is at. I've noted to myself that I want to say 5 things to you, but about 3 of them we'll just skip through because it'll be just a refresher mention, but a couple I might dwell on a bit more. Actually, before I say these 5, I've forgotten, of course, I should say something about the specific propaganda response to the drones. And the propaganda response has primarily been normalization, focusing on how well the attack was handled, and nearly transparently an anticipation of the fact that there are going to be other bigger attacks, and because of that, this one should not be traumatized. So they were saying, oh, this is nothing, we responded very well, and we shouldn't freak out about any of this. They were saying this in a way that made transparent the fact that the thought is more than available to them, that much worse is going to come, and they're going to have to try to normalize that. So this is not a time to freak out. This is not a time to go and shake about your nuclear capabilities and do nuclear blackmail. Nuclear blackmail might be back with a vengeance if Ukraine does well in the counteroffensive. So there's quite a bit more to say, but that's enough for the moment about the propaganda response to the drone attacks. Now, 5 quick points about Russian propaganda and where it's at, just to refresh us. There's one key change that's happened since the propaganda video we made on the main channel over a year ago. And that is that Putin's postmodern propaganda has gone a little bit Soviet, in the sense that it's partly moved from being post-truth propaganda to being alternate reality propaganda. Now, alternate reality propaganda tries to persuade you that something that's false is true and that you should believe it. Right? Alternate reality propaganda tries to make you doubt everything, including itself, leading to apathy and depoliticization. And that partial shift to alternate reality propaganda from postmodern propaganda, post-truth propaganda, indicates Putin's conservative but very engaged balancing of politicization versus depoliticization of the Russian population, and his sense that he doesn't fully control this process. But what that's an indication of is that if things go well, Putin wants to move toward a very big conflict with the West in the late 2020s, perhaps, with a very big military and political mobilization of society, but he knows he can't do that too early. And some of the propaganda we're seeing aimed at Russian kids, school system, is about that. There is now a partial return to the Soviet-style propaganda. 2, as always, the Russians are waiting for the West and Ukraine to experience more problems rather than feeling that there's much they can do themselves. That's not just so with the war and the West's and Putin's expectation that the West tires, right? Putin wants to get to 2024, 2025 with the West having partly given up on Ukraine. Even at propaganda level, there is the same kind of reliance on Western fatigue. What do I mean by that? What the Russians are partly relying on is the Ukrainian informational message getting stuck. And they believe that will happen with the counteroffensive. They believe that most of Ukraine's sort of exit strategies out of this crisis, and particularly their Plan A strategy, which is breaking the land bridge to Crimea and maybe causing enough destabilization of the Putin regime to see a regime change in Russia. Once that runs aground, the Russians feel, with modest gains only in the counteroffensive, that's what they hope for, there will be a kind of fatigue with Ukraine's informational politics and the perception that Ukrainian informational politics is no longer adequate to the reality we face. And the Russians are partly just sitting there and so waiting for Ukrainian informational politics to run aground. 3, they are continuing to do something we don't talk about often enough, actually, and that is seed conflict within the Russian opposition. 4, we won't talk about this now, they're continuing to engage the non-Western world, right? Because, of course, Russia is more politically isolated. Russia is more economically isolated. Russia is more politically isolated at the moment than it is economically isolated, but even its political isolation is partial, and they're trying to make it even more partial than it is. And 5, they're continuing to seed conflict in our democracies and toxicify all the things that make us fight with each other and dramatize those. That'll do for today. Lots of love. Talk soon.